So this is an introduction to Norse paganism, right? Where do these beliefs come from? How were they practiced historically? And how do we represent them today in modern society? These are huge questions. And I've been doing this for about 20 years. And I know that researching this stuff online is not always straightforward, easy, or even accurate. So I'm going to do an introduction video, crash course in Norse paganism. So first off, what does Norse mean and what does paganism mean? Well, Norse specifically refers to the Norse speaking, because that's a language, Old Norse, Scandinavians who come from the Germanic tribes. Now, paganism is a term we all know that means non-Christian, right? But it actually comes from an older term, paganus, right? Now, this term paganus in Old Latin meant a rural district. The Germanic peoples also had a similar or cognate term called heathenas, which meant essentially the same thing, a rural area or a wasteland, undeveloped area. Now, in Old Norse, we have the term coming from heathenas, heathen, which we now know as the term heathen. So when we're talking about people who believe in the Germanic traditions, they can interchangeably be called Germanic or Norse pagans or heathens. Now, these people had similar beliefs to the rest of the Europeans, like the Greeks, the pre-Christian Latin-speaking Romans, the Italic peoples, right? And then the Celts also had similar beliefs. How do we know this? Well, we look, and they had similar types of deities: a sky deity, ground deities, underground deities, elemental deities in general, and they all had these ideas of fate. These three specific females that were generally sisters that controlled mankind or the fate of mankind. Now, in the northern tradition, they were called the Nornir. They had Urthr, Verdandi, and Skuld. Urthr meaning what was or fate, Verdandi what is, and Skuld is what shall be. Right? Now, the traditions weren't originally Norse or Germanic even, because the Germanic peoples only existed from a few hundred years before the turn of the millennia. So 300 BC is the time we start seeing that culture come out and having their own language and their own beliefs. So we don't exactly know where they came from, but we do know that around the first century is when they had their own language. So that tradition was actually taken from the Proto-Italic peoples and the old Greek peoples. We see their similar writing traditions and we see similar beliefs. So we know they're connected, right? Now, the differences are that they all had their own names for these deities and their own stories about these deities. So instead of calling someone Zeus, we would call them Thor. And even in the Germanic tribes, they had different ideas. Instead of being called Thunras, it's called Thor, or Donar, which would be the Western Germanic tradition. The English now is what they're called. So basically, the cosmology all started out, there was this great gap, right? Ginnungagap, which means big ass gap, basically. And on either side of this gap, there was Niflheim, which was the eternal ice, and Muspelheim, which was eternal fire. And in between this gap, there was all this heat and ice mixed together, and it created hoarfrost, or just gigantic, like tundra, in the middle of this giant gap. And out of this gap, this cosmic cow, Althumla, licked Buri, the first god, essentially. And Ymir, which was the first giant, sustained himself, also known as Algromir or Primir, off Althumla's teats. Well, Buri was traveling around the cosmos, I guess, at first, and some of the giants met Buri, and Buri met another giant and had a kid. Their kid was named Bor, or born, or son. And Bor met this giant named Besla, right? And Besla and Bor had a son named Odin, Vili, and Ve. Or Hunir and Lother, depending on which stories you read. Well, these three entities, or gods, that were actually mixed from the two different tribes of the Asir tribe, the gods, and then the Jotnar, or Thursar, they actually ended up killing Ymir, right? Which is a very common theme in European mythology. And they created the cosmos out of his his body. His blood made the earth's water source, the sea. Eyebrows, hair, brains were the clouds, all that stuff, right? And then they had their own children, which is basically the Norse pantheon. We'll see stuff like not just Odin, but we'll see Tyr, Thor, Freya, Nana, Sigyn, yada yada yada, and we also see Vanir, Njordr, Freya, and Freyr were actually part of the Vanir. We see all these different deities, right? Now, a lot of these deities are very similar to other deities, but in the northern tradition, like I said, they have their own stories. And in certain parts of the north, all over Scandinavia and northern Germania, they had their own beliefs on to which gods were more important. This is why it's called a cultural tradition, because they all believed in the gods, but some areas believed in or worshipped some gods more than others. Notably, in southern Scandinavia, in Denmark, and in southern Norway and southern Sweden, Odin seemed to be more highly worshipped than a lot of other deities. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that the Viking Age Scandinavians, Vikinger, or Vikingar, or the coastal peoples, were constantly out searching new lands, looking for fights, trading, raiding, and fishing their way across and settling new lands. But once those people moved out of the area, like the Icelanders were much more known for worshiping Thor and Freyr. Those were deities linked to fertility and cultivation of crops. So we can see during the different areas that some deities were more important than others, especially for what those people were doing. The people who wanted to go fight and die, Freya and Odin were very important because you would either go to Folkvanger or Valhall, commonly anglicized as Valhalla, Odin's Hall, even though Freya got the first pick of half of the warriors and the rest went to Odin. So who really wants to end up in Valhalla? A lot of people still do, apparently, but and there are different areas after that. Thrudheim is considered Thor's area, and his Hall Bilskirnir, which believe means lightning crack. Then we had people who believed, sailors who were very into Njordr's realm. And also, Aegir's realm and Hall. It's talked about in Lokasena, which is one of the poems from the Poetic Edda. Now, if we want to learn about these from the source material, they come from Snorri Sturluson, who was an Icelander who wrote basically the history and the cultural beliefs of the Scandinavians down, even though Snorri himself was a Christian. He wrote what the Viking Age Scandinavians believed, how they practiced, and his understanding of it coming from his father, who was in fact a pagan. Even though he was a Christian because he was raised by somebody else, but his family still had pagans in it. And Iceland during the 1200s still had pagans existing there. And we know this from the Graugus laws, the Grey Goose laws of Iceland. So if you want the best source, you just go to the best translation you can find, which is usually Carolyn Larrington. She studied Old Norse. Or any other Old Norse person who's written one of these. Jesse Byock has done some. Not Michael Barnes. Kenneth Falk has, I believe he does an Old Norse and an English version of Gylfaginning, which is the first part to the Prose Edda, which is what Snorri wrote. And the Poetic Edda was basically a list of all the poems from Norse history. Some of them were much older, like the beginning of Norse society. We can see this from some of the linguistics they use, some older terms, older words that wasn't used in later Old Norse in the High Middle Ages. And some of these very notable poems are Voluspa, or the prophecy, the seeress's prophecy, and Halvamal, which means the words of the High One, Havi. And mal means speech, or to orate. So if you look at those two things, that's where we're going to find the bulk of our information about what was actually believed and all the stuff that has to do with that. Now, these are written using old speech, so it takes a little bit to get to them, but I don't recommend going to modern sources to reread these. I think you should go to a linguist who did a translation, and not so much to Neil Gaiman, Helen Gruber, which, don't get me wrong, Gaiman is a fantastic fiction writer. Gruber was a folklorist, and she was amazing. Helen A. Gruber. She was a German folklorist and amazing. I love her book. I have her book. I have 2 copies of it. But if we want to know what was actually written, we need to go back to the Prose Edda, which was also called Snorri's Edda, and the Poetic Edda, which was a compilation after Snorri died in 1241. It was compiled in the 1270s. Also, you can read up on Snorri Sturluson as a person and kind of get an idea of who he was. He was a historian and a poet, which in the northern tradition was called skald. And they would detail history and write it in poem form and continue the oral tradition. Now, in modern times, there's so many different iterations of these beliefs that all stem from the Norse tradition, which stems ultimately from the Germanic tradition and the greater European traditions. So there's going to be a lot of different versions of it. Now, some of the versions to look out for are versions like ethno-nationalist. If you're not accustomed to that term, it means people who believe ethnicity is very important. Some of these people believe that only Germanic peoples should be able to practice these traditions, which is a little silly because if you're a believer in these traditions, you believe that Odin created all of man, right? And this is actually talked about in Volusbau, I believe, chapter 18, Und gaf Othni, or Odin, and which means the breath of life gave Odin to Ask and Embla, which were the first humans. And then Hunir and Lothr gave them film of flesh and spirit. Spirit was Hunir and Lau. Lau is fascia, is what Lothr gave them. Now, Hunir and Lothr are called Vili and Ve by Snorri, so don't get confused by that. But some people, like the ethno-nationalists, Karl Willigut and Guido von List, they were occult writers from the 1800s in Austria, and they wrote a bunch of nasty stuff. And crazy stuff, too, like the Circle of Runes that we see sometimes in Norse books. That comes from Karl Willigut. That's not actually historical. And he influenced heavily, unfortunately, the German Socialist Worker Party, the Nazis. And in turn, those Nazis influenced other people who believed in the Germanic, cultural traditions as well, but like a bastardized or misguided version. And that group is called the Odinic Rite. Now, I'm not saying everybody in the Odinic Rite is terrible, but they didn't come from very nice origins. In turn, the Odinic Rite influenced the AFA, which was the Asatru Free Assembly, now known as the Asatru Folk Assembly. Now, again, not everybody in the AFA is pure evil, but they didn't get their origins from, unicorns and unicorn whispers and sugar. So be very careful when we're looking at sources. Now, the AFA influenced a lot of different groups, including the Troth. Their origins began in the AFA. So when we're researching materials to find out more specific items about Norse paganism, it's usually better and much harder and difficult to go with academic sources. Now, when we want to learn about the gods and goddesses, we go straight to the linguists. We say, okay, here is Snorri's words. We don't need to hear somebody else's interpretation of a translation of somebody else's work. We want to hear the direct translation from that person who wrote that work, Snorri Sturluson, and the sagas as well, also called Heimskringla in Old Norse, which means circle of the world. It talks about all the famous kings instead of just the stories about the gods, which is Snorri's Edda or Gylfaginning. And then the Poetic Edda, which is specifically about the gods. We want to go straight to those, the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, and Heimskringla. Those are the 3 sources we want to be reading. There are other sources out there that people often say are great, specifically Tacitus, Germania. I don't find that to be very accurate because Tacitus died like 600 years before the Viking Age, what people considered to be the Viking Age, which is 750 to 1066. The Viking Age was actually a little bit longer. It started in about 650 and went to about 1200. But that's because we have more recent information. Now, another person people like to say is Saxo Grammaticus. Saxo was a Danish writer, but he was heavily influenced from Christianity, and the entire reason he wrote his thing on Germania was because his boss, an archbishop, told him to. And it doesn't really detail much about the gods and goddesses, so I tend to tell people that that's not as an important or primary source so much as, Snorri's Edda, Prose Edda, and obviously the Poetic Edda and Heimskringla sagas. There is an element of racism in modern paganism, and again, this comes from the occult writers Carl Woolleget and Guido von List. And like I've detailed out, John Yowell and John Gibbs Bailey from the Odinic Rite to Stephen McNallen and his crew in the AFA, which includes, unfortunately, people like, what's his real name? It's Edred Thorson, but Stephen Flowers, who has a PhD in Germanic linguistics, but not ancient Scandinavian linguistics, which is important because he wrote a book called the Galdrebok, which is in Old Norse means magic book. And actual scholars, you can look up Jen Jochens, Jochens. She rips Edred Thorson a new asshole when when he's talking about the Galdrebok, and she's like, "That's just not correct." So it's important that we look at scholarly sources. If you guys have questions on what scholarly sources we want, I can give a huge list, but for right now, I would say look for translations of Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, the Poetic Edda. Again, Carolyn Larrington, who was a student of Ursula Dronka, probably the baddest, most awesome linguist who wrote the most detailed information on the Poetic Edda we have was Ursula Dronka. Her husband, Peter Dronka, I believe was an anthropologist. So, I mean, we can find good stuff. And if you're looking for a general catch-all book on the Viking Age, there's two specifically by the same writer. It's, gonna have to give me a second. Stephen Brinks wrote The Viking World with... I need to go pick up his book. Neil Price, excuse me. So Neil Price wrote The Viking Way, which gets more into the magical cultural traditions. And then The Viking World is a broad basic introduction to the Viking Age. And between those two books, Stephen Brinks also helped write The Viking World. Those would be a really good introduction. They're about $50 a piece, and they're about 700 pages a piece. I think the Viking Way is like 500 or 600, and the Viking World is 700 or 800. You can catch them on sale. Those are the best if you just want a broad view. And then, like I said, Heimskringla, Snorri's Edda, the Prose Edda, and obviously the Poetic Edda. If you read those 5 books, you're going to have a really good understanding. If you have any specific questions on linguistics, anthropology, archaeology, theology, or just want to kick around some ideas or disagree with me, comment below. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope everybody has a great day.